Recently, another one of those scientific studies looking at all-cause mortality between vaccinated and non-vaccinated individuals came out. This one was from France. And again, this one, now that I looked at it, it seems to be the largest of all the studies I've seen so far, and looking at the longest time frame. So it looked at, I think, nearly 23 million people. It was almost 6 million people of non-vaccinated, so it was 5.9 million, and it was so 20, I think 22 point something million. So the total would have been like closer to 30 million, like 28 million or something like that. It was a huge study. It was more than 28 million people. And how they conducted the study, it allowed them to compare everyone. So everyone was actually being compared in the study. So apparently this can give us some of the most accurate information on this topic. So of course I wanted to analyze this and tell you about it, because I've been investigating this lately, because so far all the literature that I've looked into this topic show this unusual but apparently not a surprising result from statistical point of view of what is normally expected post vaccines. And in this case, these COVID-19 vaccines, study after study show that they reduce all-cause mortality. And I will explain in a moment supposedly why scientists claims this is not a surprise, because of certain biases in what the data will show because of how the data is collected. So that's one of the angles that I'm also interested in. My name is Dr. Mikola Rashek of Genomics, and let's break this down. So I already told you how many people were being analyzed. This is from like National Registry of France. So very large population study. And few advantages over this is that there was no any shenanigans in terms of counting someone as non-vaccinated if they had vaccine and some amount of time didn't elapse. No, everyone started the study as not vaccinated. That was because the study point was before vaccination, and then you had to reach certain endpoint. One of the endpoints was you got vaccinated. The moment you got a vaccine, boom, you are in a vaccinated group. They didn't care for how many shots you got. The moment you took at least one shot, afterwards you can take 2, 3, 5, whatever, how many shots. And there were people up to 6 shots that they had data on. They counted you in a vaccinated group, no questions asked. Okay, so let's get that confusion out of the way. So that's how they measure that. So that was one endpoint. If you were non-vaccinated, you could either remain non-vaccinated for the duration of the study, or you would be automatically transferred to the vaccinated group the moment you got a shot. And then your time as non-vaccinated counted as non-vaccinated for the data analysis, and then afterwards you would be counted as vaccinated to compare you against non-vaccinated. So that's one endpoint. The other endpoint is the person died. So that's obviously we're looking at deaths of these individuals for any reason. And the last endpoint was, of course, the end of the study. And I believe the study looked at all the way to maybe 2024. It was 4 years long. It's hence one of the longest of the ones that I've seen so far. And they did something else. They not only did they compare everyone for obviously gender, and they looked at them for socioeconomic status. These are the obvious markers. They also looked at, but of course they also compared them for health. I think they even looked at geographical regions, but health one was very interesting because they literally compared 41 different health outcomes as well. And they took all of this information together, and they saw this population and took a look and see who's most likely to be vaccinated in this great mix of people based on what the characteristics are. And they assigned weight or value point to to people, to each individual, and the more likely you represented someone who is very keen to be vaccinated, that actually reduced your weight. And if you were less likely to be vaccinated, your statistics look more like you belonged into anti-vaxxers, your value would be added to this. And they actually compare everyone as a consequence, because not everyone had to be perfectly matched for everything, because that would reduce your number, but this allowed them to compare everyone. So as a consequence, you were comparing all these millions of individuals together. And the take-home message is that the vaccination status in this group, in this time span, did not increase mortality in comparison to non-vaccinated because of the vaccines. It just did not. Not only that, it actually reduced them all-cause mortality. So something we see again and again. One thing that I should have mentioned, they also looked at young people only. They specifically wanted to do this. So they only looked at individuals from 18 to 59 years old, okay? And then you could argue, okay, maybe that's why we see these statistics, because young people are much more likely to maybe survive the aggressiveness of the vaccine when you're getting it, if you believe that COVID-19 vaccine was potentially dangerous because of the spike protein. You could then argue this. They wanted to specifically look at the younger cohort because the vast majority of these studies don't focus on younger cohort. And that could be an argument, but remember, I also discussed in one of the prior videos when I actually tried to explain as to why we might be seeing these somewhat surprising results. That why surprising? Because spike protein, I do believe, is dangerous. And I am also surprised to some degree because my audience complains a lot about suffering on account of vaccines. Lots and lots of commentary. It's the most common commentary I receive is how bad the vaccines are. However, these comments come from non-vaccinated people based on what they observe in their community, supposedly. But there's also a lot of you who have taken the shot, and you write in the video comments, what are your personal issues as a consequence? So there's this disconnect between the information I'm receiving from the public and the scientific data that I'm studying. And I would like to understand why this disconnect exists, which is why I'm so interested in this topic and why I'm pursuing it so much in terms of trying to understand. Now, I'm trying to figure out whether there is some maybe mechanistic explanation to it besides the very obvious scientific explanations that all scientists give us. And I'll tell you about that right away. But the argument is that maybe we didn't see this drop in increase in mortality in vaccinated in this younger cohort is because they were younger, but we see the same pattern in every single data I've analyzed. So the Danish study I discussed before, when I tried to explain the potential mechanistic possible reasons, the Danish study was of only older people, so people who were 65 years and older, and they also saw reduced all-cause mortality in the COVID-19 vaccinated group in comparison to non-vaccinated group. I saw that in the Italian study, in the 2 UK data studies as well. So I'm seeing this pattern again and again and again. And the question is, why are we seeing this? And the number one explanation that comes back again and again is this healthy vaccinee bias. So, and what is that? One of it is that vaccinated individuals have a different behavioral pattern than non-vaccinated individuals. They're more likely to seek healthcare and have a conversation with the doctor type of thing. But there's other also elements that play into it that I wanted to tell you. So oftentimes, and a lot of you complain, hey, oftentimes these studies do not start measuring the comparison immediately from the point of vaccination. So for example, the measuring point in this study, I believe it was 6 months post-vaccination. And the 6 months is ignored. And a lot of you mentioned, well, by ignoring that 6 months, maybe this is why we're seeing this data being skewed like this, is because is because we're ignoring the first 6 months, and the vaccine would have been the most dangerous in the first 6 months. And that's fair argument. However, these authors also specifically on the side looked at the first 6 months as well. So first of all, why do you do this delay? And this delay is actually in order for the people who are not vaccinated not to skew the data. Why is this? It's because people who are really sick, they would not get vaccination. They would postpone vaccination till they get better. By the way, you're supposed to do that. You're not supposed to be getting vaccinated when you're sick. You're supposed to specifically delay your vaccination till you're feeling better, because of the possibility that vaccine might not work properly if you're getting vaccinated while you're sick. Same with people who feel like they're close to death. They might not get vaccinated, and as a consequence, such people, if they die soon after these decisions, they will skew the data in favor of the vaccinated cohort. So you'd make this delay in order not to skew the data to the benefit of the vaccinated group. Of course, then you can make an argument. Well, what if this actually argument improves the data for the vaccinated, because all the vaccinated people are dying in those 6 months, and that might be the case, but these authors also looked at just the first 6 months, irrespective, like if you got vaccinated, what were your chances of dying in those first 6 months? And once again, they showed lower all-cause mortality than non-vaccinated people. And by the way, overall, the all-cause mortality was about vaccinated group was about 25% less likely to die than the non-vaccinated group for any reason. But there's another also interesting thing that they did. Didn't just do all-cause mortality. They also subdivided into categories of deaths, and they looked at variety of different categories of deaths. So, and the ones that I was very curious about was cancer. So overall, COVID protection was one of the largest, and people who were vaccinated, they were almost 75% less likely to die than non-vaccinated people from COVID. Okay, that makes sense, I suppose, right? Because that's why we were getting vaccinated for COVID, right? But then the cancers, I was curious about cancers, because one of the other elements of all of these data that I've been looking at is that the same data that shows that vaccinated people have reduced all-cause mortality, the same data also shows that the same individuals show elevated incidence of cancer. And nevertheless, this data showed that vaccinated individuals were also dying less frequently of cancer. Not as much as all-cause mortality, it was lower than that, but still a little bit lower than non-vaccinated group, right? And same thing for cardiovascular diseases, so strokes and heart attacks, any category they looked at, vaccinated people always showed less death than non-vaccinated individuals, even in areas where vaccine would have nothing to do with it, such as accidents. Just like, so imagine car accidents, and why would that be? That's an argument as to the scientists make in all of these studies, that this represents a bias in the data, that because clearly vaccines should not have anything to do with this. The only time so far that I've seen where vaccinated individuals were showing elevated mortality over non-vaccinated was post first vaccine only. And we saw that in the UK data, if you recall that. And then afterwards, people who already had second or third shot and so on, their mortality reduced. It waned, so that protection from reduced mortality for any reason eventually would disappear. And the inflection point based on the UK data suggests that it might be somewhere in 2024. So about 4 years, as long as this data lasts. So we'll be curious to see what kind of data we will see in the future, if this these type of studies were to be expanded for even longer time period. But nevertheless, this bias might not be erased just because of how the data is collected. And the only way we would really know, and we could truly know, is to actually have randomized clinical trials that track this information for a very long time period. But we can't do that because we unblinded our clinical trials. So remember when we started clinical trials for both, say, Moderna and Pfizer mRNA vaccines, within few months, those who took placebo, meaning they didn't take the vaccine, they thought they were getting vaccine, but they didn't. We had that comparison group, so they were essentially non-vaccinated, but practically all of them eventually got vaccinated. So we forever lost that capacity to be able to truly compare the differences via randomized clinical trials. But I'm also curious, can this be in any way explained mechanistically? Because ultimately, in order to believe whether this effect is real, we cannot just have the data showing this, because, as I mentioned, data can introduce biases. We would also have to have this data seen all over the world for many different time periods, and then have a plausible mechanistic explanation. And this is where I'm also wondering whether, to some degree, these IgG4 antibodies that we're seeing in practically all of the mRNA vaccinated individuals, whether they have some protective role. Because remember, these antibodies actually start protecting vaccinated individuals from inflammation, and whether that plays a role. And I also suggested in one of my prior videos whether regulatory T cells that seem to be also produced post-vaccination, whether they could be providing that effect that, surprisingly, if you survive the attack of the spike protein that came from the vaccine, which might explain the one-time vaccination problems that we observed. Once you survive that and you had second vaccine and third vaccine dramatically increase these IgG4 antibodies, and therefore this protection that was induced, which is very unnatural. We don't normally see this in nature, but we see this now in all mRNA vaccinated people, whether this now somehow might be contributing, at least temporarily, as to why we observe these unusual reduced mortality in mRNA vaccinated in comparison to the non-vaccinated individuals. And I don't know what the answer to this. I'm just curious whether that might be an explanation. And remember, I just recently did a video explaining how the ratio of these IgG4 to IgG1 antibodies targeting spike protein is one of the correlating factors whether a vaccinated individual will recover from any spike protein toxic damage, meaning long COVID, really. And there was the study showing this specifically. There is that Goldilocks ratio that helps increases the likelihood that such individuals will recover from long COVID. And you see there's this pattern, right? And that makes me also wonder, should we start collecting these IgG4 antibodies from vaccinated individuals as a potential therapy for spike protein problems for long COVID? And this is not some wild abstract idea. We were doing exactly that when the pandemic first started, and we didn't have any protection against it. There were no vaccines yet. We were isolating antibodies against the virus from people who were infected, survived the virus, and produced the antibodies. And we're isolating those antibodies to start inoculating people who were never infected yet, to protect them, or who got infected, who were starting to show serious disease, and you could introduce these antibodies to start protecting them. That was referred to as something like convalescent plasma treatment. So that's a very real concept. And I wonder whether we should start thinking about the possibility whether we should be isolating from mRNA vaccinated individuals these IgG4 antibodies that seem to be able to protect these individuals from spike protein damage, because these antibodies literally cloak the spike protein and they make it invisible to the immune system. And of course, they also bind to the spike protein. So to some degree, the spike protein will also become irrelevant in terms of the damage it could do to the body. Something something that's on my mind right now. And we'll see, will longer time durations show differences in the future in terms of all-cause mortality or not. But right now, surprisingly, right now, based on what I'm receiving from the audience, the all-cause mortality seems to be lower for the vaccinated COVID-19 vaccinated group in every study I look at. What that means is that if you know of any studies that are already peer-reviewed that show other trend, please leave it in a comment. I'd love to study it, but don't give me some blog or anything like this. I want peer-reviewed studies so that the scientific argument can be sound, right? So if you know of any studies that I haven't come across yet, drop it in a comment below, and I'll study it. See if this if I'm just simply reading only information related to the positive results, and there might be negative results that I'm just simply missing as well. That's all I'm gonna talk about today about this topic, and I'll see you guys next time. But first, also, please like, please share, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and please also check out my Patreon account. That's my private account where all my content comes out first. Almost all of my content comes out first before it makes it to YouTube, and my patrons get to vote what comes out onto the YouTube. And another thing is that I'm trying to communicate with my patrons, including whether you're supporting Patreon or you're just there for free, in terms of what it means to lead a healthy living life, because in my mind, that's the number one thing we should be doing, including especially for mRNA vaccinated, because for me, where the IgG4 antibodies perhaps play the biggest role in terms of risk is in cancer, even though this data that I just presented to you today apparently showed reduced death rate for cancer in comparison to the non-vaccinated. But nevertheless, that's at the moment still the biggest area of concern for me when it comes to these IgG4 antibodies. And again, remember, our population immunity is changed, completely changed. It looks very different. We've never had a population where so many people in a population had a very high levels of IgG4 antibodies. All right, that's it for now, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.